Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivardhari Yasodanandana Brajajana Ranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Kishore Kishori Ki Jai. Jagannath Baladev Subhadra Marani Ki Jai. Gornitai Ki Jai. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So this morning we're reading from Canto 10, chapter 51, and the text for today is 42. And it's a text that doesn't have a purport, so we'll chant responsively. Soham tavanugrahartam guham etam upagataha prartita prachuram purvam tvayaham bhakta vatsala Soham tavanugrahartam guhamitam upagataha praratita prachuram purvam tvayam bhakta vatsala Soham tavanugrahartam guham mitamupagataha praratita prachuram purvam tvayam bhaktavatsala. Please chant. Soham tavanugrahartam guhamitamupagata pratita prachuram purvam tvayaham bhaktavatsala. Soham tavanugrahartam guhamitamupagata pratita prachuram purvam tvayaham bhaktavatsala. Soham tavana gruhartam guhametam upargata pratita prachuram purvam tvayaham bhaktavatsala. And the word for meaning. So, that same person. Aham, I. Tava, your. Anugrah, of the favoring. Artam, for the sake. Graham, cave. Etam, this. Upagata, approached. Paratita, prayed to. Prachuram, abundantly. Purvam, before. Tvaya, by you. Aham, I. Bhakta, to my devotees. Vatsala, affectionate. And the translation? This is Krishna talking. Since in the past you repeatedly prayed to me, I have personally come to this cave to show you mercy, for I am affectionately inclined to my devotees. And purport, there's a very short purport. It is apparent from this verse that Muchukunda was a devotee of the Supreme Lord. He had prayed for the Lord's association, and now Shri Krishna granted his fervent request. Om Jnana Timirandasya Gyananjana Shlakaya Chakshurinmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manopistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Tadati Svapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Guru Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Ragutam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Deva Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishaka Vitamscha. Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gourangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpataribhyascha Kripa Sindhubhye Vacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnebhyo Namo Namaha. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Shrimati Romapada Swami Iti Namine Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Shrimati Bhaktivedanta Swami Iti Namine Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Sunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So this particular text has a statement that's been made by Lord Krishna to King Muchukunda after Lord Krishna has responded to King Muchukunda's request. And his request had been, these were his words, "O best among men," he's addressing Krishna, "if you like, please truly describe your birth, activities, and lineage to us who are eager to hear." So that was back in text 30. And this particular request on the part of King Muchukunda to Lord Krishna, this note is made in the purport to that particular text that, and it's from the BBT purport, that Muchukunda's question led to a clarification on the point that the Lord is not actually a human being, because he referred to him, "O best among men." And the purport to text 30 highlights that King Muchukunda makes his inquiry in a noble way for his own and others' benefit. Indeed, Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he says that the request on the part of King Muchukunda, this request of Lord Krishna that he should describe his birth, his activities, his lineage, to us who are eager to hear, as he says, it reveals the noble position and the qualification to hear from Krishna by his usage of the plural, the fact that he says, "to us who are sincerely eager to hear." So yesterday there was a brief moment in the discussion with the speaker where there was in the audience, one devotee saying that, he didn't like the usage of "we" when somebody was speaking, because the "we" was not taking into account individual consciousness. So in this particular case, actually when King Muchukunda uses "we," or he says "to us," so there's nobody else in the cave except him and Krishna. And he says, "to us," referring to himself, who are sincerely eager to hear. It reveals actually a qualification on his part to be hearing, because he's showing deference to Lord Krishna, and he's also, by usage of the royal "we," he's actually indicating some humility. So it makes him very qualified to hear. So this is a different usage of the plural "we." So now, this kind of request has an underlying worldview that is coming from spiritual culture. Now, the worldview that's been highlighted is this: Krishna is the supreme controller, proprietor, and enjoyer. Everything is meant for his pleasure. And I'm going to draw from there was a devotee who visited this temple quite a few years back. I mean, with the COVID, it feels like, a decade passed. But anyway, it was pre-COVID. A devotee who I think resides in Germany, a European devotee, and she has a book entitled Krishna's Divine System, Devi is her name. So she actually does a listing of 4 points that indicate a worldview that somebody brings to their interactions. So I'm drawing from her breakdown of the worldview that one holds if one is practicing spiritual culture. So the one I just read is one of those worldviews. There's a second worldview. This is one who's practicing spiritual culture. The goal of life is to establish a loving relationship with Krishna and give pleasure to him. So, in parentheses, sense gratification is kept to a minimum with the ultimate goal of losing taste and attraction for sense gratification. A third worldview one holds is, I'm not this body, but eternal spirit soul. So in parentheses, spiritual culture is meant to decrease bodily identification, gross and subtle, and specifically, it is meant to subdue and dissolve the false ego. And the fourth view, spiritual cultural view that one holds, if one's practicing spiritual culture, there is not only one life, but many lives, which lead us to the understanding that we have to accept responsibility for our actions in this life. And in parentheses, one can say, by performing purifying duties or dharma within Krishna consciousness or Krishna conscious practices, we qualify ourselves to return to the spiritual world. So those are four worldviews one holds when one's practicing spiritual culture. And King Muchukunda's behavior has been one of showing his good qualification, particularly because he holds these worldviews. And he introduces himself in this way. He says, he's addressing Krishna, dark cave, but it's illuminated by Krishna's effulgence. The one and only person who's there, the other person that was in this cave, was simply burnt to ashes. So now it's just the two of them in the cave. And he addresses Krishna in this way to introduce himself. O tiger among men, we belong to a family of fallen Kshatriyas, descendants of King Ikshvaku. My name is Muchukunda, my lord, and I am the son of Yavanashva. So he's introducing himself, as per Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, has him noting his good qualification by saying he's a low-class Kshatriya, a Kshatra Bandhu. So this indicates good qualification because his intention is to show his humility and his good quality. So not, I am the son of Yavaneshva, and I have just executed several yugas of battle, defending the demigods, defeating all opponents. I even had a kingdom where nobody was my rival. That's not how he introduces himself, but rather that he's a fallen Kshatriya. So, not a very important, a low-class Kshatriya. So this statement of his, introducing himself to Krishna in this way, is in line with the worldview of decreasing bodily identification and subduing the false ego. The false ego, one always has to point out what belongs to one and the position one holds. That's the false ego. And notice how King Muchukunda, who was pretty exalted and certainly had quite an extraordinary resume, so to speak, he just introduces himself as a low-born Kshatriya. And he's actually coming in the lineage of King Ikshvaku. So a very noble lineage. And his further statement to Lord Krishna has him saying that he considers Lord Krishna the chastiser of his enemies. And this is how he puts it. The man who woke me was burned to ashes by the reactions of his sins. Just then I saw you possessing a glorious appearance and the power to chastise your enemies. So in fact, King Muchukunda says, again, through me, you destroyed this foolish barbarian. That's what he's actually saying. And again, he's acting in accord with holding a spiritual, cultural worldview. By performing some purifying duty within Krishna consciousness, one is qualifying himself to return to the spiritual world. So he sees himself as having performed a duty for Lord Krishna, because he had received the boon that should the person who wakes him up after his many yugas of battle on behalf of the demigods, that person is going to be burnt to ashes. And when that moment comes, that this barbarian, Kaliyavana, actually wakes him, in fact, he gives him a violent kick. This is what King Muchukunda says. That barbarian got burned to ashes as a reaction to his own sins. And he's in fact saying, through me you destroyed this foolish barbarian. So he's seeing that action that happened as actually having been a duty he performed on behalf of Lord Krishna. Now there's this third statement that's made by King Muchukunda, and he says, these are all one after the other, and he's addressing Lord Krishna. Your unbearably brilliant effulgence overwhelms our strength, and thus we cannot fix our gaze upon you. O exalted one, you are to be honored by all exalted beings. So these are one after the other. How he's both introducing himself, how he's reflecting on or making his observations about Lord Krishna. So this particular statement is very much in accord with Krishna as the supreme controller, proprietor, and enjoyer. And that's the worldview that's surfacing in this statement. Just by him saying you are to be honored by all exalted beings. And this particular worldview, in Sri Ishopanishad, in mantra form, there's a slightly different angle, but it's a similar kind of glorification of Lord Krishna that is a spiritual cultural worldview. So this is mantra 4 in Sri Ishopanishad. Although fixed in his abode, the personality of Godhead is swifter than the mind and can overcome all others running. The powerful demigods cannot approach him. Although in one place, he controls those who supply the air and rain. He surpasses all in excellence. So there's a similarity in the view. King Muchukunda, Sri Ishopanishad Mantra 4. And it lies in this insight on the personality of Godhead. He comes to be known only by his devotees. And at that, it's through his mercy that he allows himself to be known. So King Muchukunda's observations are only possible because he's a devotee. So there's mention of how Kaliyavana had tried to reach Lord Krishna. So his trying to reach Lord Krishna had nothing to do with feeling some devotion, but rather animosity. He was determined to have a battle with Lord Krishna and defeat him. So here's how what happened with Kaliyavana trying to reach Lord Krishna, and this is quoting from Srimad Bhagavatam in the 7th verse of the same chapter. Appearing virtually within reach of Kaliyavana's hands at every moment, Lord Krishna led the king of the Yavanas far away to a mountain cave. So to him it appeared Krishna was just within reach, but Krishna made it like that to be able to lead him to this particular remote mountain cave where he was going to have his devotee perform some service for him, because it was King Muchukunda who was residing or resting in that particular cave. and who had that particular boon and was going to bring about the end of this Kaliyavana. So this understanding of Krishna as one to be honored by all embodied beings, and that of him surpassing all others in excellence, is an understanding arrived at through some preconditions being met. And Krishna explains these preconditions. So this is from Bhagavad Gita 2.54. A person free from all attachment and aversion and able to control his senses through regulative principles of freedom can obtain the complete mercy of the Lord. And that's Raja Devesha Vimuktais 2, Vishavan Indriyais Charan, Atma Vasyad Vitayatma, Prasadam Adhigachati. So the precondition that has to be met is that the senses are engaged in the transcendental service of the Lord. As Srila Prabhupada qualifies, even if a person in Krishna consciousness may apparently be on the sensual plane, because, for instance, we're looking at King Muchukunda, and he appeared to be, you could say, on the sensual plane. He was just sleeping and sleeping and sleeping and sleeping. But because of his being Krishna conscious, he has no attachment to the sensual activity. In the case of King Muchukunda, he was performing it for a particular purpose because he'd been awake for several yugas fighting on behalf of the demigods. And the explanation was given by His Holiness Ramapada Swami that the opponents, the Rakshasas, they actually fight at night. Because generally the Kshatriya code is that the battle stops at the end of the day. And then everybody goes to their camps. And in fact, even the enemies may visit each other in the camps. But the battle begins in the morning, ends in the evening. But with the Rakshasas, there's no civilized behavior. So they actually fight in the night. And actually, that's when they're strongest, in the nighttime. So so King Muchukunda had to be awake day and night in order to fight this battle. So you could say, externally, you see that this king just slept and slept and slept and slept and slept and slept. So he might appear to be on a sensual plane. But this is how he explains the sleeping. I was fatigued after remaining awake for a long time, and my senses were overwhelmed by sleep. Thus, I slept comfortably here in this solitary place until just now. Someone woke me. And Srila Prabhupada, he gives a generalization, and I'm drawing this from the purport to the verse where there's the explanation of the preconditions that have to be met in order to be able to actually appreciate Lord Krishna's position and obtain his complete mercy. So this is Srila Prabhupada, what his generalization. He says the Krishna conscious person is concerned only with the satisfaction of Krishna and nothing else. That's very interesting. That's one's main drive. That's one's whole motivation in life, is the satisfaction of Krishna and nothing else. So, in fact, this is a reinforcement of that worldview held by one in spiritual culture. That worldview is the goal of life is to establish the loving relationship with Krishna and to give pleasure to him. So, King Muchukunda, he acts according to Lord Krishna's desire. The devotee, as Srila Prabhupada explains, can act or not act, for this is within his control, because he acts only under the direction of Krishna. So you notice, a regular person may think that he can choose to act or not act, but actually that's not the case. A regular person who's not actually engaged in the transcendental service of the Lord is not in this wonderful position of being able to choose, am I going to act or not act? Because it has to do with the fact that one's working under the direction of Krishna, so then one can always think carefully. A person not engaged in the transcendental service of the Lord doesn't have that particular option. They're impelled to act according to the dictation of the mind. So Muchukunda holds the spiritual cultural worldview. He says, the man who woke me was burned to ashes by the reaction of his sins. Just then I saw you, possessing a glorious appearance and the power to destroy your enemies, which I'd read, but it's significant here again. So the purport states that through Muchukunda, Sri Krishna destroyed the opposition of the foolish barbarian. So it was such a simple act. I mean, to really look at it very objectively, if somebody's extremely proud, determined to challenge Lord Krishna, I mean, what could be a more, what could be the word, clear view that Krishna held of that pride? He ran away from him, and then the barbarian is thinking that he's going to catch Krishna, and Krishna is actually leading him to his death, and his death is just going to be by a king waking up and using the boon that he got, so the entire body burns to ashes. So truly, the man comes across as totally insignificant. He had actually, I mean, to just be burnt to ashes by a person who wakes up, I mean, it truly is putting somebody in place in terms of pride. So going back to King Muchukunda, the precondition to receive Krishna's mercy is to follow the regulative principles of freedom. So that's how it's called. It's the regulative principles, not just regulative principles, but they're regulative principles of freedom, because it brings freedom. And this was evidenced in King Muchukunda's selfless service in defending the demigods. He's following regulative principles, and this is the demigods reporting on what King Muchukunda did. They say, abandoning an unopposed kingdom in the world of men, O valiant one, you neglected all your personal desires while engaged in protecting us. So King Muchukunda was performing selfless service of giving protection to others. And there's an interesting statement. It's from the 3rd canto and the 31st chapter of Srimad Bhagavatam, where it says, what's the effect of performing such service, selfless service, to give protection to others? And this is the statement. It's made by Lord Vishnu to Kadamba Muni. He says, showing compassion to all living entities, you will attain self-realization. Giving assurance of safety, you will perceive your own self as well as all the universes in me and myself in you. So this particular action of being compassionate to others and of actually giving the assurance of safety to others, it allows for self-realization. It allows for realization of Krishna and that connection with him. And Srila Prabhupada, he comments that the Lord wants to fulfill his desires unlimitedly, and the devotees also serve him to fulfill his unlimited desires. So there's, and this is Srila Prabhupada, there is an unlimited oneness of interest between the Lord and his devotees. It is, so in this verse that we're reading today, Lord Krishna reveals this oneness of interest that Srila Prabhupada points to that exists there between the devotee and Lord Krishna. Because he says, since in the past you repeatedly prayed to me, talking to King Muchukunda, I've personally come to this cave to show you mercy, for I'm affectionately inclined to my devotee. So there's that kind of mutual interest, the praying on the part of Lord Muchukunda to eventually come to have Krishna's association, and Krishna actually coming to give association and allow for King Muchukunda to perform some service. So to make a connection between one's worldview and the act of praying, which is what is highlighted in this particular verse, one can say there is the idea to always think of Krishna, not theoretically, but actually think of him. And I'm going to quote a very interesting prayer. It's comes from Satsvarup Maharaj's book, Life of Prayer, where he writes, so this is an example of someone, a sannyasi in our movement, praying, actually wanting to be able to think of Krishna. So this is the prayer. My dear Lord, let me remember you during the day in prayers of recollection. My dear Lord, let me remember you. I don't want to be a zombie or a stone. My dear Lord Krishna, just see the beautiful cloud banks and above them the clear sky. This is you, right here in the material world and in the holy name. You are there too. Please let me appreciate your presence and appreciate that I need you at every moment. And then he ends it with saying the Maha Mantra, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So those are some thoughts on this verse. If there's anything to expand the discussion or some query that comes based on what was presented, please go ahead.
Whoa, I think that's loud. Anyway, thank you, Masaji. Thank you for your class. You made a lot of wonderful points. You were basically, one point you were making is that Muchukunda, from an external point of view, from a superficial point of view, somebody may see him sleep and sleep and sleep, and they're like, this is a devotee, he's a couch potato. And so we see that, Mukunda was physically, you were basically saying Mukunda was physically asleep but spiritually awake. And in the material world, it's completely the opposite. People are physically awake but spiritually sleep, Jeev Jago, basically. So I appreciated that point you were making. You can't judge a book by its cover. And that was the whole point Vaishnava Sevananda Prabhu was making yesterday. And the other point maybe you could expand on that I really appreciated is that you said Kaliyavana was only a few inches within the reach of Krishna, and he was chasing them. And in Muchukunda, he didn't have to chase Krishna, but Krishna came to him. And the reason I love that is because it reminded me of something Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur said. He basically says, darshan means to see the Lord, and devotion means to act in such a way where the Lord wants to see you. There's a chapter in the Sri Bhaktisiddhanta Vaibhav, I believe it's called The Seer and the Seeing. And Srila Bhaktisiddhanta famously says, we should not think of the Supreme Lord as an object of our vision. Instead, we should meditate on how we can acquire the qualification to become worthy objects of His vision. In other words, don't try to see God. Act in such a way where God wants to see you. So we see that Muchukunda, he didn't have to go anywhere. The Lord came to see him. Kaliyavana, he was chasing Krishna, but still he could not capture him because he had demoniac qualities. So can you, I have some thoughts, but maybe you could share, how do we truly know whether we're acting in such a way where the Lord wants to see us? Because Muchukunda from an external point of view, he act like a materialist. He burned somebody to ashes that made him angry. And similarly, Durvasa Muni, he wanted to burn to ashes with that fire demon, Ambarish Maharaj, because Ambarish made him angry. But we see in that lesson, Durvasa was motivated by envy, Mahamaya, his ego, whereas Muchukunda was impelled, inspired by Yogamaya, Krishna's sanction. So how do we know in our life, because in the final analysis, we can't judge others, how do we know for ourselves whether or not we're acting in such a way where the Lord wants to see us?
Yeah, it's a very excellent question. The question being, how can one understand for oneself that one is acting truly in relation to Lord Krishna's desires versus acting in a way that is more on the materialistic plane and making Krishna be very distant from us. Yeah, it's a very interesting thing because if one considers that most of the persons one comes across, at least in this particular environment, are persons that are holding that worldview, the spiritual cultural worldview, that Krishna is the goal of life and that one wants to perform actions that please him. So then how do you truly know that your actions are pleasing or not pleasing? Well, it depends on how thick your pride and I'm using that word because I heard Subal use it recently, and I thought it's an excellent word to describe something that's like an impeding layer on the heart, a thick layer of pride. And pride is coming from false ego. So the concept one's holding of oneself, and if that concept that one holds of oneself slides into the picture, then there comes to be this discrepancy between actions being performed in relation that are in line with the worldview of one's false ego versus in line with spiritual worldview. So that subtle shift into the false ego is usually prompted by something that challenges it. So someone, depending on the learned patterns that are there, so through many lifetimes we've been having experiences, and so we've come to form certain conclusions and learn certain things that we think are ourselves. So it's different for different persons, but when a challenge comes to that false ego view that one holds, so I am, let's give an example. I know I am in the right, and I know that I am entitled to sympathy, respect from others. Somebody challenges that worldview and says, actually, you're just a stubborn person. You're a stubborn person. The worldview gets challenged. But I know that I am right. How dare somebody actually pass some judgment of me that's contrary to my view of myself, because I know that I'm right and I'm perfectly good. I'm perfectly good. No fault with me. The fault lies with the other person. So, in order, then the shift has moved from spiritual cultural worldview that I want to perform all my actions in relation to Krishna. Now I'm going to start performing actions in relation to my false ego. So now, in order to defend the fact that I know I'm right and the other person's definitely in the wrong, and I have to defend my rightful, correct view of myself, false ego. Krishna's not in the picture at all here. The spiritual cultural worldview where you try to balance the action you're going to perform with, like, oh, is this going to be introducing the question, is this in line with where I want to go with a spiritual cultural worldview? Am I moving in the direction of pleasing Krishna? Instead, it becomes, let me keep intact my false ego. Then what transpires after that is, can take many routes. A favorite route where one has to be in the right is one tries to speak ill of the person who criticized one or did not hold the same view of oneself according to the false ego, the picture one has of oneself. So it can take the form of criticism of a person. It can go extreme even, where one even tries to destroy the other person. So that is, and then once one is on the path of defending one's false ego, the spiritual cultural worldview is just not in the picture. So that's what it is. It's like shifting into the false ego view of oneself. That is when one can know that one has lost the discrimination that would allow one to pause and carefully reflect. Let me stay more in line with the spiritual cultural worldview. My ego is suffering, but what do I care about this false ego? Rather, let me actually do the noble thing. Let me rise above the false ego and let me actually go to another devotee that can give me some sort of reassurance that I actually can proceed in a dignified manner, even if my false ego is screaming revenge or screaming criticism. Let me find a devotee who can at least encourage me to keep quiet, to dutifully do what I have to do, to respectfully just avoid the person until I get a bit stronger internally, or I can fight my own false ego. So one is sometimes faced with that kind of choice. So that's in response to your question, Jai Baladev. And sometimes you actually see somebody on the path of defending their false ego and you think, wow, 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 what a commotion, what a disturbance. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, Mataji, thank you for the class today. You mentioned that Krishna and his devotees become one, I think you said.
In interest.
And interest?
And keep going.
Okay. But does that mean that we become one with Krishna, the devotees?
No, not at all. there's an interesting explanation where Srila Prabhupada looks at that particular point from the point of view of persons who are pantheists versus persons who are devotees. So the pantheists will say that actually Krishna is the mountains, the streams, the trees, the rivers, the sea, living entities, and Srila Prabhupada challenges that and says that so if one holds that kind of view, one will see a oneness with Krishna and each of those particular objects. But Srila Prabhupada challenges that and says that the difference between that kind of pantheistic view and the view that a devotee holds, or one with holding spiritual cultural worldview, is that the person holding the spiritual cultural worldview will understand that actually the interests of Krishna and their interests in relation to Krishna are one. So Krishna is the entity eternally himself, and oneself is eternally oneself. But the connection, the oneness, is in terms of sharing a mutual interest. The spiritual cultural worldview one is walking around with is, the goal of my life is to please Krishna. And so there's that wanting to make the connection and perform one's actions in relation to him. And Krishna himself is feeling great affection for his devotee who's wanting to please him. Like, affection, caring. So there's a mutual interest, a oneness of interest. The devotee cares for Krishna and Krishna cares for his devotee. The devotee cares to please Krishna and Krishna cares to shower his affection on the devotee and bring great good fortune and make the devotee's life beautiful and extraordinary and perfect. So quite different. Thank you. Oh.
Thank you for the good class. My question is, how is there anything that you've heard as far as something that really touches the heart of a person when we're preaching and trying to bring people to Krishna consciousness? Is there anything that you've heard that, like a way of really touching their heart?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because it implies that there's blockages in the heart. So the blockages are on a subtle level. So the biggest blockage is the pride that I mentioned. That's like a major blockage. And it may be, it's a very subtle one. You can't see it necessarily, but that's what you're up against. The pride of who the person believes they are, the pride of their accomplishments, the pride of their status, their position. So when the question's asked, how do you touch the heart of somebody, it means that you have to find a way to go past the pride factor. And there's different degrees of pride, but generally that's what the blockage is in the heart. So one good way, I suppose, is to have the person perform some little action that is more in line with spiritual culture. So sometimes, I've heard that book distributors, they have a person just hold a book. So it means they're holding Krishna for a brief 1 second in time. That book contains Krishna, is Krishna if it's the Bhagavatam. So that way, they've unknowingly, a whole chunk of pride has been chipped away. Unknowingly, because they actually held for a moment. I guess it's like Putana holding, holding Krishna. It's an act of service has been done. So I've heard of that one. It's a very simple one, and you don't realize the huge significance of it. But it's actually done the part that words could not do of actually chipping away a chunk of pride. Because you have to there's a certain humbleness in holding a Bhagavad Gita or a Srimad Bhagavatam or any other book that's of spiritual value. So that's the one I've heard of. Thank you very much. And Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Thank you so much for your very kind additions and contributions to the class. I'm very grateful. Thank you. Thank you.